and unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect Dharma is rarely met with even 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning, everybody. So one of the joys of being fully vaccinated and being able to gather together again like this is we get to use this teapot that we haven't been able to use for a while, that Caroline was so nice to acquire for us. And that's second only to the fact that we can actually be with each other. And that's very, very nice. So, has anybody ever heard of the Anti-Mask League? Anti-Mask League? No? It was formed in San Francisco in 1918.
Oh.
Yes, during the flu pandemic
Sure.
that took lives. And so it goes to show that human nature is human nature. And some of the reasons, I did a smidgen of research, and some of the reasons that the Anti-Mask League put forward for their anti-mask stance were similar to the ones that we hear now. Impingement upon their liberties. And here, people today have been saying that, requiring masks violates their freedom. And this morning's talk is on the topic of freedom. And the notion of, that kind of notion of freedom is, to me, a rather childish, grandiose, and narcissistic sense of freedom. Freedom of limitless autonomy. That, I'm free to do whatever I want to do. I'm free. And I don't have to concern myself with how my actions impact the other. So that's why I say it's a narcissistic sense of freedom, because it has no authentic, responsible relationship to the constellation of persons and situations that comprise this moment of our life. It's not a fully awake notion of freedom, and it's an irresponsible notion of freedom. Literally, quite literally, because it's not able to respond to any condition or need outside of the individual's caprice, which a word we'll see Buber use, meaning my own impulses, my own desires and preferences. Those are the sole concerns, and so that's literally, the word responsible means able to respond. And so that notion of freedom is, by literal definition, an irresponsible notion of freedom. And it's kind of like, gravity is oppressive. I want to be able to fly to the top of that building. Gravity won't let me. Gravity is impinging upon my freedom. And so I'm making that analog, a radically autonomous notion of freedom is like, rebelling about the law of gravity, And thinking about this talk, I for a note for myself, which I'm not looking at right now, I made the note, gravity, the couch potato, and the cyclist. Because, the couch potato, you're familiar with that phrase? They kind of like, they're resigned in the face of gravity, in a sense. They let it do its worst to them, and they're the condition of their heart, the condition of their body, The body atrophies, the heart weakens. The cyclist, I'm among them, not only do we gravity actually gets us stronger, and somebody who stands up, gravity makes them stronger. But also, gravity helps us to fly. Because a little confession, I can't quite understand these recumbent tricycles on 3 wheels. Because the joy of cycling seems to be removed. Because, in cycling, in order to make a turn, you have to what's the word I'm looking for? Counteract to the angular momentum by sloping into the turn. So you're not free to stay upright. You have to slope. But that's a dance. That's a delight for me of cycling, is the fact that we're balancing, and that when we make a turn, we do this, and it feels like freedom. It feels like flying, because I am honoring the constraints of gravity. And the constraints of gravity contribute to my sense of freedom on the bicycle. So that's just an introduction to a notion of freedom. What is freedom if it isn't limitless autonomy? Limitless autonomy is, I propose, a naive, narcissistic notion of freedom. So what is freedom if it's not freedom to do what we want? What is human freedom? Does the word have any meaning? And that brings up the whole philosophical debate between free will and determinism. Is there such a thing as free will, or is everything deterministic? This is an ancient philosophical question, and there's a story in the Book of Serenity. This is a wonderful artifact. Little brief discurses on the nature of this artifact. It's a collection of encounter dialogues between a student and a teacher, between a teacher and another teacher, or a teacher and a methodological being. And then, so this artifact, this book, collects 100 of those stories, and also other commentarial material about those stories, and the author of this final artifact collects the 100 stories, collects the poetic utterances of another teacher in the past, and other commentarial stuff, and his own poems. And so I don't know if you know what the Talmud is in Jewish literature, where they have a text of Torah or something else, and then around that they have rabbinical comments, and and it's actually, the page is actually created that way. We have the Torah portion in the center, and the various rabbinical commentaries around it. This is purely linear. It doesn't do that, but it's the same kind of feeling, where you're getting the story from multiple perspectives, which we won't be going into very much today. Mainly just the story. And once again, the story. Caroline, would you mind pushing that light up for me?
Sure.
And it's all the way up. It's one of those. Yeah, there we go. It's a story about freedom, and it's entitled "Bai Zhang's Fox." Bai Zhang was a well-revered Chinese Zen ancestor, and he's credited with creating the monastic rules of Chinese Zen, which informed Japanese Zen, and which informs Zen in America today. The Indian rules didn't work for China. In the Indian rules, you couldn't work, you had to beg. But in India, there's this culture of wandering seekers, and there's a culture of supporting wandering seekers. In China, no such thing. So they couldn't beg for food and still survive. It's a lot colder in China, so they couldn't get away with 3 thin robes. So they worked, they changed. So they had to create, in short, they had to create a new kind of monastic life, and Baijiang is accredited with having been a major contributor to that. So here's the story, and this is one of the ones that is probably more mythological than historical. So it's a teaching story. When Baijiang lectured in the hall, there was always an old man who listened to the teaching and then dispersed with the crowd. So there's always, he'd give a Dharma talk, and there's always some old man that wasn't part of the normal scene of folks that would show up for the talk. But then, he would just disappear. But one day he didn't leave. And Baijiang then asked him, "Who is standing there? Who are you?" The old man said, "In antiquity, in former times, in the time of the ancient Buddha Kasyapa," that's a Buddha before Buddha, so it's before primordial beginning, "I lived on this mountain." And that means he was the abbot of the monastery then. And a student asked me, "Does a greatly cultivated man still fall into cause and effect or not?" So does an enlightened person. Are they subject to karma? Are they subject to cause and effect? I answered him, "He does not fall into cause and effect. And I fell into a wild fox body for 500 lives." So this student comes up and asks this old man, is a greatly enlightened person free of cause and effect, free of karma, free of determinism, you might say? And I answered him, he does not. He's not subject to cause and effect. He's free. He does not fall into cause and effect. And I fell into a wild fox body for 500 lives. So now I ask you, Baijiang, to turn a word on my behalf. So, can you help liberate me from this wild fox body? And Baijiang said, "He is not blind to cause and effect." The old man was greatly liberated at these words. So the old man responded to the question by saying, the greatly enlightened person is not caught by cause and effect. He doesn't fall into cause and effect at all. And as a consequence of that, the effect of that cause was for him to be enslaved in a wild fox body for 500 lives. And Baijiang's response was, he is not blind to cause and effect. Now, like I say, we're not going to go into the extensive, there's like 4 pages of commentary. We're not going to go into that. But one thing that I did want to mention is the author of this book, his own commentary says, "The old man was greatly awakened at these words. He based his logic on actuality. So he was freed by actuality." And Wansong says, "Not falling into cause and effect is forced denial." So saying that I don't have to wear a mask because I'm free. Well, you're denying that there's a pandemic, that lives are at risk. So not falling into cause and effect is forced denial. Not being a nihilistic view. That's the complete sentence. Not falling into cause and effect is forced denial, actually a nihilistic view. Actually, it's irresponsible. It denies the meaningfulness of cause and effect. Not being blind to cause and effect is finding the wondrous along with the flow. Now that's a very interesting phrase, and that phrase, finding the wonder along with the flow, recurs in the book in various places. And so the flow is a metaphor for cause and effect, the flowing of moments. Each moment, causes and conditions bring this into being. So that it's the flowing of causes and conditions that manifests the cosmos on each moment. finding the wondrous along with it is that there's something miraculous about the arising of being, and there's something that there's something life-giving about being present, to, not being blind to that, being attuned to that, awake to that. There's something wondrous, and there's freedom there. If you're awake to cause and effect, there's your freedom. Like if you're responsive to gravity, you can ride a bike. If you ignore gravity, you're going to fall over. And so the wondrous is if you're awake to cause and effect, you can participate in the dance. If you're blind to cause and effect, like the old man, you actually become a victim of cause and effect, and you fall into a fox body. So freedom is not found independent of determinism, using the word loosely, but freedom is being awake in the midst of deterministic properties and responding in a living way to deterministic properties. So as we'll see, Buber says only he who encounters fate actualizes their freedom. Same point, that that freedom is not found independent of the constraints of the conditions, but freedom is found in a awake, responsible interaction with conditions. So one look at something Suzuki Roshi says about freedom. See if it opens right up. No, I look at the notes. See if hopefully I saved it to a note. Sorry, hang on just a second. Okay, this is from the section called The Quality of Being. And he starts this Dharma talk by saying the purpose of Zazen is to attain the freedom of our being, physically and mentally. So he uses the word freedom there. The purpose of Zazen is to attain the freedom of our being, physically and mentally. Now, interestingly, one mythopoeic way of describing monastic practice is putting a snake in a bamboo tube. Now, the snakes like to wiggle. That's how they get around. That's how they motivate. And so you take that snake and you get this. Bamboo is very straight. You put it in a bamboo tube, it can't wiggle anymore. And so, by constraining the snake from wiggling, the snake has an opportunity to see its essential nature, because it's the basic understanding. That if we're a plaything of desires and impulses, if we're always wiggling, if we're always being capricious, we can't actually feel the quality of our being. But when we sit in Zazen, and at least physically, we constrain impulses. If we have an impulse to get up and slap somebody across the face, we have to restrain it until the bell rings. I like to facetiously say. So at least physically, we're constraining impulses, and if we're doing the practice conscientiously, we're restraining mental impulsive activity too. The spinning of mind, the fashioning of narratives about revenge or victimization or grandiosity, what have you. We restrain that kind of impulsive mental behavior. And we restrain the sense of a separate self, and that very vigorous restraint of capriciousness, of habit energy, allows us to see no boundary to our being. Is the way I would like to put it. We can realize no boundary to our being. Now, what does that mean? It means that you're sitting, you're just sitting, and a thought arises into awareness. You're just sitting, and an emotion might rise into awareness. You're just sitting, and birdsong might arise into awareness. You're just sitting, and a vast forest. If you're outdoors, a vast forest may rise into awareness. And with the snake in a bamboo tube kind of restraint of consciousness, the notion of dualistic consciousness, the notion of self-other, can be deconstructed. And that on some fundamental level, to say that a thought or an emotion is self and forest and birdsong is other doesn't hold water. In the moment of arising, there's no justification for that identification. So with this kind of restraint of Zazen, we can realize the freedom of our being in the sense of this boundary of self and other becomes porous and more and more porous, and a vaster sense of self arises. And so we can fly. Dogen in Mountains and Water Sutra says that the way of riding the clouds and soaring in the wind comes freely from the mountains. And so you can fly because you are the mountain. You can fly all the way to the moon because there's no separation between you and the moon. And so that's little commentary on what he means when he says the purpose of Zazen is to attain the freedom of our being. And elsewhere in the book, he says that there's a misunderstanding about freedom. I'm not going to look it up. I'm going to just kind of reconstruct it. And that people, especially young people, have this notion that freedom is to do whatever you want. And that's not our notion of freedom. To express our freedom, we sit in a cross-legged position. And so then that connects to this notion of freedom. But he goes on to say, in this section, opening section of the quality of being, according to Dogen Zenji, every existence is a flashing into the vast phenomenal world. Each existence is another expression of the quality of being itself. So, that's the Eastern notion of the creation of the cosmos. It didn't occur 5,000 years ago, whatever the Buddhists say. It didn't occur at the Big Bang. It's happening now. Always, now, over and over again. Now, every existence is a flashing into the vast phenomenal world. Each existence is another expression of the quality of being itself. So our freedom is free to inhabit or be or manifest the quality of our being, which requires everything. It's inextricably implicated with everything. It cannot be manifested independent of gravity or viruses or humidity. Being able to honor fully the conditions that are arising right now is a precondition of being able to feel our actual nature, our full human nature, and being able to realize or appreciate, awaken to our full human nature is the notion of freedom in Zen. So, what I wrote here is, so one might say that the freedom of our being consists, at least in some measure, in living in full cognizance of the quality of our own being Yet we cannot do this in isolation. Our being is implicated with and determined or brought into being by the vast being we emerge into each moment. We cannot encounter our freedom in this vast emerging being without living in responsible relationship with it in all its particulars. Responsibility means able to respond to this moment of being with its particulars of gravity and pandemic. On what basis we choose to respond determines our condition of freedom. And then I wrote, living in responsible relationship with the vast emerging being. Another way of saying this is our authentic human freedom is connected with our capacity to love. That to bring our love fully online. So there's something about love that's unconditional. You know, I thought about the movie Gandhi, where he's trying to arouse people to nonviolent resistance. And I think it's probably historical, I'm not sure, but, you know, so, you know, he says, I'm not, and he says, and there's some critique about passive resistance, and I'm not asking you to be passive, I'm asking you to fight, and, you know, and to resist. You know, they may beat me, they may kill me, don't have my dead body, not my obedience. So something like that the movie goes. So in the same sense, you know, that, you know, people could do all kinds of things, but they can't keep you from loving, you know, and the early Christian martyrs demonstrated that. I think authentically, this was before Christendom, so I think the church was in a healthier state then. And other individuals have shown that, Martin Luther King demonstrated the unconditional quality of love, that, nobody can stop you from loving. There's something unconditional about love, because love is not a condition. Love is not a thing. Love has no color, no specific gravity. You know, it's not a material thing. It's part of the formless realm, we would say in Buddha Dharma. It's part of the unconditioned. So there is the unconditioned. So when we talk about being awake to conditions, it's not a strict determinism that we're looking at, because there is still freedom. The conditions that arise are there, and they're irrefutable, they're implacable, but they don't determine our response. Our freedom is in our response. I have thought that, and this is what the Buddha taught in terms of karma, conditioning. You know, the word karma literally means action. It also means our conditioning, the way we've acted in the past, which creates habit energy, a proclivity to continue to act that way if we're not conscious. If we're not awake to cause and effect, then if we're blind to cause and effect, we'll just play it out unconsciously. And so that's the sense of karma. Both, etymologically it means action, but by implication it means the past action which has a certain energetic impulse that will play itself out if we don't offer any kind of resistance to it. So karma also means conditioning. When we chant all my ancient twisted karma, it means, we've done things that we're not proud of, but we don't want to ignore that, or else we'll continue to do those things. So that's basically the dynamic. We're trying to be not blind to cause and effect. So the Buddha taught that, look at the actions of the past, of body, speech, and mind, and you will see the mind and body of the present, because that's what conditioned the body and mind at the present. He says, look at the actions of the present, and you will see the mind and body of the future. So these conditions arise, and they cannot be otherwise. But the action of the present moment establishes a condition, and it can be an unconscious action or a conscious action. And if it's a conscious action, it might be an expression of our freedom. But our freedom is a conscious action in relationship to the causes and conditions that implacably present themselves to us, and we can't negate gravity. We can't go maskless without some risk of contagion until we're fully vaccinated, and it's reduced dramatically, etc., etc. So I want to look at Martin Buber, and see some of the things that he says about freedom. You know who Martin Buber is? I love Martin Buber. So he talks about the unfree man after he talks about the free man, but I want to start with the unfree man and then go back to the free man. And he does use the male pronoun, but this book was written in the 1920s, so let's be forgiven, please. The capricious man does not believe and encounter. Now notice that word encounter. Responsible relationship to the causes and conditions in the moment. So Buber had this dialectic of I thou, or I you, and I it. And without going into detail, I you, I it is subject-object dualism. The subject, and then there's these objects out there that I like or dislike, I use in certain ways to my own advantage, And it could be with integrity or without, but it's a dualistic subject-object orientation. I you is subject-subject, where I encounter being in the beings I encounter, and they bring me into being, and I bring them into being in relationship, in dialogue. So that's a shorthand for his I it, I you dialectic. So, because he uses these terms, and I want to have some foundational understanding when you hear the terms. The capricious man, the man of unlimited autonomy, I want my freedoms, I don't want you to tell me what to do. The capricious man does not believe and encounter. He does not know association, responsible relationship, able to respond. He only knows the feverish world out there and its feverish desire to use it. We only have to give use an ancient classical name, and it walks among the gods. When he says you, he means you, my ability to use. What he calls his destiny is merely an embellishment of and a sanction for his ability to use. In truth, he has no destiny, but is merely determined by things and drives, feels autocratic, and is capricious. So he feels free, but he's being dragged around by desires and impulses. Feels autocratic, but actually he's caught by his karma, by his habit energy. He has no great will, and we'll talk about great will in a little bit, and tries to pass off caprice in its place. For sacrifice, he lacks all capacity. And then we can stop there. That's his description of the unfree man, the capricious man, man enslaved by karma, caught by karma because they're blind to it. So Buber says, free is the man who wills without caprice. He believes in the actual, which is to say, he believes in the real association of the real duality, I and you. So he believes in the actuality of the being arising in this moment, that being in the authentic connection to it will reveal his destiny, his freedom to choose. He believes in destiny and also that it needs him. So that's it. These causes and conditions are making a request. They want to dance. Gravity wants to dance with creation. Without the curvature of space-time, there would be no universe. So these conditions, they're requesting our participation. He believes in destiny and also that it needs him. It does not lead him, it waits for him. He must proceed towards it without knowing where it waits for him. He must go forward with his whole being, that he knows. It will not turn out the way his resolve intended, but what wants to come will come only if he resolves to do that which he can will. So, we can't manipulate causes and conditions, but the fruition of love will only happen if we're determined to be in some kind of responsible relationship with things. If we try to control to a predetermined outcome, that's not love. But if we meet the living moment in a living way, then it's like I'm looking for that term for how plants turn towards the light. Photokinesis, is that it? Yeah. So kind of like if we bring our awakeness to the moment, it's kind of like photokinesis. So if we try to control it, we'll kill it. But if we just try to respond in a living way, something of value is present in the world. So he must sacrifice his little will, his limitless autonomy, do what I want because I'm free, to his great will, which moves away from being determined to find destiny. So the great will moves away from being determined by conditions to find full freedom, which is destiny, which is authentic relationship to what's present. He no longer interferes, nor does he merely allow things to happen. He listens to that which grows, to the way of being, with a capital B, in the world, not in order to be carried along by it, but rather in order to actualize it in the manner in which it, needing him, wants to be actualized by him, with human spirit and human deed, with human life and human death. He believes, I said, that this implies he encounters. So it's not a belief that's an abstract conceptual formation of dogma or creed. It's a belief that I can authentically relate to this moment because I've done it. It's nurtured my spirit, and I choose to do it again. So this notion, so I want to kind of that's Buber's exposition of freedom. And I want to expand a little bit on this notion of, he sacrifices his little will, which is determined by things and drives, in order to encounter his great will, which meets his destiny. So what does that mean, little will and great will? Well, it means, we come to the moment with intention, with what Paul Tillich calls ultimate concern, what in Buddha Dharma we call vow, and the root of the word vow, the Sanskrit is pranidhana, which is translated as aspirational prayer. I take refuge in Buddha before all being, immersing body and mind deeply in the way, awakening true mind. That's a kind of pranidhana, aspirational prayer. When we say that, we try to orient our being in the understanding of Dharma, which is both the teaching of the Buddha and the sutras, and also the causes and conditions of this moment is Dharma. The truth, gravity is Dharma. And so we say these things which are intentions. And Paul Tillich had this notion of ultimate concern, that faith is a condition of being ultimately concerned. Like if your ultimate concern is to get rich, then money's your God. If your ultimate concern is justice, then justice is your faith. And so the great will is, an orienting energy that is different from the energy of karma. It's the energy of not being blind to karma, but bringing to karma our love, our commitment to living our life in a certain way, to have a authentic relationship to being, with a capital B, which is everything in all its particulars, and having some way of offering ourselves to that, to change and be changed by it. And that was Buber's definition of dialogue. Dialogue cannot happen unless we're willing to change and be changed by the other. But that's not like and that always happens. It's not like I'm going to change you in a certain way, then I expect you to change me in a certain way. No, if we have an authentic interaction, we change each other. And so, the pranidhana, the great will, is to enter into that consciously, in the service of spirit, in the service of love. I rushed back into my study to pull out this book to share with you what this author's. This is a book. The title is "Vanishing into Things." An interesting title. It's a very interesting poetic way of talking about the Eastern notion of liberation from a sense of separate self. Vanishing into things, which is a term that was coined by another scholar about a Taoist author. And let's see. And so this notion of vanishing into things brings to mind for me what Dogen says in Jokoan. He says, to study the Buddha way is actually to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. So, when I was talking about Zazen earlier, in that, putting the snake in the bamboo tube, we can realize the boundarylessness of our being, where a thought arises, birdsong arises, and on some fundamental level, it would be arbitrary to call oneself and one other. That's the praxis of vanishing into things. Does that make some sense? I'm just a little discursus about the title, because I love the title, but the quote is something else entirely. He's talking about Wu Wei effectiveness. Now, Wu Wei, or more completely Wei Wu Wei, that Chinese term means the action of non-action. So a paradoxical description of a certain kind of action. And he talks about it here. Wu Wei effectiveness requires an aptitude for the subtle signs of incipience. So, Wu Wei effectiveness, to effectively act or dance with things, requires an aptitude for the subtle signs of incipience, the beginning or becoming of things, discerning points where development remains pliable, and can be inconspicuously diverted. So, an aptitude for the subtle signs of incipience. So you see the arising of causes and conditions. You have a subtle aptitude for seeing how things are coming. You're not blind to how things are arising. You see their character, and you're right there where development remains pliable. One example is, you're on the freeway and you're cut off, and you feel that adrenaline rush from a near-death experience, and it's pliable. You can choose to get pissed off, or you can choose to pray and hope everybody's okay. So you see that adrenaline rush, and it's still pliable. It doesn't have to be rage yet. So that's, I think, one illustration I would offer for the point he's getting about, you're being in relationship with the incipience, the subtle signs of incipience, the beginning or becoming of things, discerning points where development remains pliable and can be inconspicuously diverted. So, and I think that's a sufficient thing. So when I talk about being in an authentic, responsible, loving relationship with causes and conditions, and having a great will, or pradidhana, or an intention that determines the character of the response, that's my understanding of freedom in the Buddhist sense. You're not free of conditions, but you're not enslaved by them. You're dancing with them, and you're bringing your heart online to nurture possibilities that may be latent or just incipient and needs a certain touch. He listens to that which grows, to the way of being in the world, not in order to be carried along by it, but in order to actualize it in the way it wants to be, needing him, wants to be actualized by him. That's the freedom, where we can participate in a nurturing way in the ongoing of creation. A request is being made by the birds, by the virus, by global warming, all these things. And our freedom is, how do we engage our life energy given these conditions? So it's a closing chant for the talk. Oh, I haven't had any tea yet. It's so engrossed. So hang on a second. Let me have some tea. Are there any questions or comments before we close?
Been thinking about in our discussion yesterday, and then you're clarifying and expanding on that today. It reminds me of the political theory of negative and positive freedoms, which negative freedoms are freedom from, and positive freedoms are freedom to do things, and that most of this tends to sound like, or at least a lot of the liberation we talk about tends to sound like it would fit into the negative freedom category, as in it's freedom from the things, the constraints that determine you, and that freedom too, in a lot of ways, is a descriptor for the things that are part of that more, well, I use it, less skillful way of thinking about it. As you're describing, as your counter to the ideal way of seeing freedom, in that you're looking at things that you want to do or things that you think you should be able to do, and saying I have a right to do those things. I have freedom to do those things, and that doesn't mean that all of them fall into that category, but that can roughly fit across that paradigm that way.
I think that this dichotomy or that schema of freedom from, freedom to is an unintentional red herring.
Yeah.
It doesn't actually address the ontological nature of our condition. It's abstract. It's purely subjective. It doesn't honor interdependence. And so I think it's insufficient schema for trying to understand what freedom might actually mean. In fact, that's my feeling.
Mhm. Yeah.
I hope this isn't a stupid question, but what does freedom and self say about dealing with things like viruses? I sort of interpret from that we're kind of all one,
Yeah.
all part of the same universe.
Yeah.
We are one. Let's look at ourselves that way.
Yeah.
Is the virus part of that?
Yeah.
He doesn't seem to want to be friends. For most people,
Yeah.
well, not for most people, he's okay. But for a certain percentage, he wants to sicken them. He wants to kill them.
Well, I think you're anthropomorphizing the virus, and giving him a sense of self-reflective awareness that I would suspect she or he lacks. Gender, probably she didn't.
Well, he's just lower on the evolutionary ladder, as you know.
And so you're if you will, that your argument could be equivalent to the sun's not our friend, because unless we put on certain sunscreens, the sun's going to kill us. The virus on some fundamental level is just wanting to live, and life feeds on life. Even if we're vegetarians, we're in order to keep our organism going, we have to consume life. Okay. And so that's part of causes and conditions, and our freedom is unconditioned. Our freedom is love, which is unconditioned. And so if we look at only from the eyes of good and bad, we're caught in conditions. But if we if we can bring unconditioned awareness to things, then we can go ahead and live and die without feeling that it's all an absurd affair.
So I shouldn't take it so personally.
Yeah. The bug's just trying to get along,
There was a study done on people's perceptions of coronavirus, and they said that for a lot of people, they were more likely to take safety standards seriously if the virus was framed for them as an entity of malice that wanted to hurt them. But if it was presented only as a feature of the world that's has its own conditions that are acting on us, and we need to act accordingly, they didn't see that as a threat because it wasn't out to get them, right? Which the study basically suggested a change in communication tactics. But the point was that for many people, something has to have this ill intent for them to see it as something worth taking seriously.
That's very interesting. The third ancestor Zen, said that argue for good and bad and you become a person of good and bad. In other words, you become enslaved by good and bad. That, Zen, kind of like Nietzsche, but different from Nietzsche, is beyond good and evil. That the nature of things transcends good and evil. The ultimate nature of things transcends good and evil, and good and evil occurs from confusion. The sense of self and other is a big source of evil in this world, and splitting. If there's good and bad, if there's self and other, you want the bad to be someplace other, and you want the good to be self, and so it's dualistic. and it has some provisional usefulness. There are evil deeds that or occurrences that provisionally can be said to be evil because they're harming others, etc. But ultimately, metaphysically, in Zen, there's no metaphysical evil like Satan. That the evil that manifests, its root is confusion, a misunderstanding of the nature of things. That there is actually an other to hate. And so, the virus is just doing its dance to survive, which, survival implicates death, just as our survival implicates death.
It's not punishment for anything.
No, it's just...
It's not evil karma.
No, it's...
And karma is always portrayed as punishment, right? And I think
well, not always.
usually in Western culture.
That's a Western misinterpretation of karma. But, it's, you put your hand on a stove and you feel pain. That's karma. That's not punishment. That's just the unfolding of things. With ignorance, the unfolding of things with ignorance is you put your hand on a hot stove because you're ignorant of it and you get burned.
Yeah, and my father always used to say, "I bet you won't do that again."
Well,
he was right.
Yeah,
but I tried the next burn.
But human nature is such on subtler levels we repeat behaviors, like the Anti-Mask League of 1918. Anyhow, so the closing chant. May our intention equally extend to every being and place with the true merit of Buddha's way. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it.